All right, welcome everybody to our final webinar of the year. Our emotional well-being webinar series is going to close out the year. I'm Amy Liebman, president of NTM Info and Research, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Welcome back, everybody. Today we welcome back Dr. Devin Smith. Devin Smith is a licensed clinical psychologist. Her professional background has involved researching and treating psychological factors unique to chronic illness and health concerns. She has worked in a variety of medical settings, including oncology, primary care, cardiology, pulmonology, infectious disease, sleep medicine, and NTM-related clinics. Currently, she is an assistant professor at National Jewish Health in Denver, Colorado. Welcome back, Dr. Smith. We're glad to have you. So for today's session, rebuilding or building your confidence. It's a similar format to what you're used to. There's the question and answer section where you can type in your question. If you want to send it anonymously, you hit send anonymously, and then once you're done, you hit send. At the end of the presentation, I will start reading out the questions from the queue for the presenter. We'd like to thank INSMED for their support throughout the year for our programming, and we'd like to thank the support from people like you. Without support, we could not continue to bring this wonderful programming to you. We look forward to bringing you another full slate of programming next year. Don't forget to follow us on social media, and you can also learn more and sign up for the latest news at ntminfo.org. And if you've missed any of our webinars, they are all video recorded, and you can find the archive of them on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/NTMIR. And thank you very much. And Devin, I am going to hand the floor over to you. Take it away and welcome. Thank you for closing out the year for us.
Of course, I'm happy to do it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And like usual, Amy, I'm just going to have you confirm that you can see it okay. All right, do you see that okay?
We can.
Great. Okay, thank you. So yeah, tonight I'm going to talk a bit about building your confidence, and what I specifically want to focus on is self-esteem. So it's very much related to confidence. I want to talk about low self-esteem, what it is, how it functions, and how you can improve it. So I'll talk a little bit about, like I said, what low self-esteem means, and then factors that help sustain it. So we'll talk about 4 different factors here: unhelpful core beliefs, unhelpful rules for living, negative predictions, and unhelpful behaviors, critical self-talk. And you'll understand how that all works as I get to it. And then we'll get into specifically for each factor some ways that you could improve your self-esteem, your confidence, by evaluating and maybe altering some of these thought patterns. So you don't have to take this, quiz per se, but I just want you to look at these items and think how much you agree or disagree with each of these statements. So I feel like I'm a person of worth at least as much as others. On the whole, I'm satisfied with myself. I never feel useless. I encourage myself kindly when things don't go right, and I have a number of good qualities. So think about where you'd fall on the spectrum for each of these. If you're thinking disagree or strongly disagree for a lot of these, or even just 1 or 2 of them, you might have some areas of low self-esteem that you're struggling with. And so even if you're answering, not specifically to these situations, do you feel like that's you're falling into those categories? Sometimes our self-esteem is activated, low self-esteem, by certain situations. So overall, these are just some indicators, like I said, that maybe you're struggling with low self-esteem. And what I mean by that is really the opinion that you have of yourself. So self-esteem is basically just how you view yourself, how you think of yourself. And some research shows that people who have low self-confidence, so trust in your abilities, qualities, capabilities, skills, all that good stuff, tend to also have low self-esteem, and vice versa. So they're very interrelated. Sometimes the terms are used interchangeably. And so your self-esteem affects how you live your life. How you view yourself and your abilities really impacts how you go about your day-to-day functions. When you have low self-esteem, you tend to see yourself, the world, your future more negatively and critically. When you have healthy self-esteem, you tend to think positively about yourself. You're more optimistic about life in general. You know that you're valuable, and you're able to name some positive qualities of yourself, at least a few. If you struggle to name anything good about yourself, then you're definitely struggling with low self-esteem. But again, it could just be in certain areas of your life. So, it definitely affects, like I said, how you see others, yourself, the world around you. But you might doubt your ability to rise to any struggles or challenges that you might face and have little confidence in yourself to overcome them. So when we're talking about NTM, self-esteem definitely leads into how you feel you're able to manage this illness. A lot of chronic health conditions, our self-esteem impacts how we view the illness, how we view our worth as health changes, and then how we're able to tackle any of the consequences or challenges that come up with that. And so you might find yourself feeling anxious, sad. I highlighted or underlined here unmotivated because that's definitely a consequence of low self-esteem. So if you take, for example, weight, that's a common area for people to have low self-esteem about. The negative self-talk that you might have if you're struggling with weight, sometimes people feel that that's going to be beneficial for them because it's going to motivate them to make a change, when research shows it does the exact opposite. So the more critical we are of ourselves, the harder it is to make any changes. And so, because it's kind of this why try attitude. So motivation is definitely lower when you have lower self-esteem. And you might just be harsh on yourself. You might find yourself saying things like, I'm worthless, I can't manage this. And even if it's not explicit thoughts of how you're thinking, a lot of times that's the underlying theme. And so when we look at low self-esteem, it can affect all different kinds of areas. Like I said, not thinking much of yourself, criticizing yourself, blaming yourself for things, focusing on weaknesses, feeling unable to assert yourself. So when someone has low self-esteem, sometimes it falls into a category where they're always trying to please other people, or go above and beyond with friends or family or certain situations, because you're, like I said, the beliefs dictate how you act around other people because of how you view yourself. So when you're trying to meet certain standards, you might just go along with whatever people say because you don't feel like you can assert yourself. You might apologize a lot. That's another sign of self-esteem issues. Avoiding challenges or trying to be perfect, feeling self-conscious, uncomfortable, low self-confidence, being eager to please other people, or feeling like you don't deserve treats or anything good that comes to you. So people that have low self-esteem might struggle to not only see the good in themselves, but to realize that they may have had a hand in good things coming to them. And I'll talk more about that. So self-esteem, like I've hinted at, does exist on a spectrum. So some people just have low self-esteem in certain situations. It only affects them when they're around certain people or if they're in certain situations. So it's triggered, the self-doubt is triggered by the situation. So, a common example is like a social situation. Sometimes that can trigger low self-esteem for people that are uncomfortable in social situations, but they feel they have higher self-esteem in other aspects of their lives. They're not really critical of themselves in other ways. It's just specific to that social area. Same thing with our ability. So if our ability to do things changes, like let's say that we're struggling with our health and we're not able to do as much, that can trigger low self-esteem as well. That's a situation that's pretty common to affect our self-esteem. Or sometimes people with low self-esteem, it colors everything they do. It's all situations. It's not specific to any one situation. It's this constant doubt, self-criticism, this inner monologue of just doubting yourself in a lot of different situations. And so we can separate low self-esteem into how we think, how we feel, how you might act, because it's all interconnected. So how you think about yourself and the situation or other people, it's going to impact how you feel and then how you react to situations. So here's some examples, but let's say that you, imagine yourself as worthless or lesser, that's going to impact how you feel. You're going to feel sad. You might feel anxious. You might feel worried. And it's going to lead to certain struggles. You might try to overcompensate, criticizing yourself, not putting yourself in situations because you feel like you can't achieve a certain standard. And so it's all linked to how we kind of go through the world around us. I'm not going to go into detail about this because I'm going to break it down, but this is just an overview of how these 4 factors that I talked about in the very beginning are related. So core beliefs is the first concept that I'm going to talk about, but it's basically, beliefs about yourself that just underlie everything. So this example of, I'm not good enough. So that impacts then how we think about how we, our rules for living. Well, I'll talk more about that, but if you think your core belief is true, you might try to overcompensate with these strict rules for living. So, if someone thinks they're not good enough, they're always trying to please people, not trying to let anyone down, trying to be good enough. And so what this ends up doing then is leading to how we predict things to happen and maybe unhelpful compensation behavior. So when you worry you might break one of these rules, like always pleasing people, never letting them down, you might have doubts or predictions like, what if I upset someone? And maybe you just avoid a situation entirely because you're worried about letting someone down, which can then lead to speaking to yourself in a critical way, really berating yourself for how you reacted to a situation, which might then underlie that initial core belief of I'm not good enough. So you can kind of see how this cycles around, and I want to specifically talk about each factor in a little bit more detail. So let's talk about core beliefs to start with. So core beliefs are judgments, conclusions, and interpretations about ourselves based on what we've learned or experienced. So this can look a lot of different ways here. Everyone's core beliefs are slightly different. And when we're talking about low self-esteem, it's usually negative. So, I'm worthless, not good enough, unacceptable, I'm stupid, inferior, whatever you want to say, but it's this core belief about yourself that probably developed from the world around you. So maybe how you were raised or experiences you saw when you were younger, things happening around you, things that happen in your life, how other people have treated you. Maybe it's even just the society around you. So it doesn't have to necessarily be your upbringing. It can just be what you've viewed around you, how other people were treated, how you're internalizing that. And so the issues with core beliefs are they're really not entirely true. And so when we have core beliefs, they feel like facts, even if they aren't. So because they're so ingrained in us, these beliefs about ourselves, it tricks you into thinking they're truth, like 100% truth 100% of the time. And that's usually not the case. Things aren't that clean cut. And so it could feel hard to argue with fact, and it might even feel hard for you to question it because it's just how you've always viewed things. But a better way to think about a core belief is that they're usually opinions that you've formed about yourself. So going back to that example of I'm worthless or, I'm not good enough, those are opinions that you've formed of yourself, not necessarily facts. Core beliefs, like I said, they come from experiences. So nobody's born believing that they're worthless, unacceptable, a failure. These are things that we learn from other people around us or how we've been treated. So, really they're conclusions that people form based on, what we've learned from our environment. So, an example would be if someone has a very critical parent, so a very critical mother or father that's always mad at them, they might come to believe as a child that they're a bad person because their parents always mad at them. So that must mean they did something wrong. But from an outside perspective, you could probably see that that person is not a bad person. There's a lot of other factors to the situation. And so that's what I mean by they're shaped by our experiences, not necessarily fact or truth. Core beliefs are often too simplistic to be entirely true. So there's often little pieces of truth in there. For example, people that think they're a failure have probably failed at points in their lives at various things. But that's only a part of the picture. They haven't failed at every single thing they've ever done in their life. And so it's very simplistic and it's overlooking a lot of other factors that's part of their life. And so human beings, we're all complex. There's a lot of shades of gray. It's not just black or white. There's a lot of in between. And so when we think of things as, I'm a success or I'm a failure, that's cutting out a lot of that gray area in between the two. Core beliefs are often biased, so it affects how you see the world. And so it can twist your successes so that they seem like failures, or make it easy for you to not see the evidence of the opposite. So it creates this bias. We tend to only pay attention and make sense of things that are consistent with our beliefs and rules. And so if we think we're, not good enough, we're going to see all the ways that that makes sense in what's going on around us or how we're interacting with other people. And even if we see something that might be, contrary to what that belief is, we're going to write it off. And so we want to try to make sense of things. And so we actually become biased because we're trying to fit things into this narrative that we've formed. Core beliefs can also be dormant. So with chronic health conditions, we all have beliefs about health, about, our ability to do things, what good health or bad health means. And these are likely dormant until we experience an issue with our health. And then those, can be triggered to explode like a volcano, because they were underlying how we think of maybe illness or health. But until it became personal to us, it wasn't really relevant. And so that can be true for a lot of different things. The way we think about ourselves or the world around us doesn't really become an issue until we're put in a situation where it blows up in our face, so to speak. And so core beliefs can change how we interpret things in our environment, which then influences how we think and feel and act. So if you think of how we perceive the world around us, everyone perceives it a little bit differently. If I say someone was rude to me, someone else might not agree with that. That might not be how they perceive what that other person said or did. And so how I view that situation is influenced by basically these core beliefs, these beliefs that influence how we interpret our experiences. So the example here is it's like a pair of sunglasses. Everyone has a different shade that causes them to see things differently. So if a situation where someone, let's say, meets a new person and they're thinking about asking them out for coffee, someone that has this low self-esteem or low self-confidence of, I'm not worthy, is going to have these thoughts like, why would this person ever go out with me? I'm not even going to bother because, they're never going to say yes. It's going to filter how they view their success in that situation. Whereas if someone believes they have a shot, that they're a worthy person, their thoughts are a little bit more positive or neutral at least, and they might, proceed with that behavior where they don't feel like they're at risk of failure. And so it's usually not the event that causes, these emotional reactions. It's usually our interpretation of the event. And so that's really key in when we talk about core beliefs, because they filter how we view certain situations and events. And so when we talk about challenging unhelpful core beliefs, and this is an exercise that you could practice if you feel like maybe you have some beliefs about yourself that you want to look at and maybe explore. The first step is really understanding what unhelpful core beliefs you might have about yourself. And so there's some examples here. I'm ugly, I'm unlovable, I'm boring, I'm worthless. And then choose one of those, choose a core belief, and just try to list 3 pieces of evidence, that goes against this negative core belief. So it's a very simple exercise. You don't even have to write it down. You can think about something you believe about yourself or something you've been telling yourself, and challenge yourself to think of 3 reasons why that might not be entirely true. What might other people say? What might a friend say about this? Oftentimes, if you remove yourself from the situation a bit, it's easier to see things a little bit more positively. If you want to get a little bit deeper with an exercise like this, you can really ask more in-depth questions about these beliefs. So here's a list of common, they call them irrational here. That used to be older terminology. We don't really call them irrational anymore. We just say if they're helpful or unhelpful. Because sometimes they're not totally irrational. You just have to ask yourself if it's helping you or hurting you. And so, some different examples here, but you can take a belief, whether it's on this list or whether it's something that, you can reflect on and select, and try asking yourself, 4 of these questions. there's various questions on here that you can ask. What's the evidence for or against this idea? And that's one of my favorites for challenging a belief or a negative thought. Asking yourself, what's the evidence for this belief? What's the evidence against it? Is this belief 100% true 100% of the time? If not, why? Usually you can find little cracks in there where there's room for an alternative perspective. You can ask yourself, is this fact or an opinion? Reminding yourself that a fact is observable and provable. Is it observable and provable that you're not enough, that you're worthless? And if it's not observable and provable, why? What proof do you have? What proof do you have against it? Does this belief ignore evidence? So, if you're saying, I'm a failure and you've been successful at one thing in your life, well, then that's ignoring some evidence, that might suggest you're not always a failure. So you can ask yourself some of these more in-depth questions to really, the goal here is just trying to come up with some alternative perspectives. And you don't have to truly believe these perspectives at first. It's helpful to even just be able to think flexibly like that. So to see that, I have a belief that I may be worthless, and I know that I've done some really good things and that I have worth in this life. And so it's kind of like viewing things on a spectrum, not just black or white. Like I said, seeing those grays in between. And so the next factor here is unhelpful rules for living. And so rules and assumptions for living guide our behavior and help us make sense of the world and function on a day-to-day basis. And so rules for living, they're necessary, for us to, function and be functional humans in society. We have to view things a certain way and live accordingly. And it's not necessarily unhelpful if they're realistic, flexible, adaptable. So if you can change them based on the situation, they're usually pretty good. They're more unhelpful when they become unrealistic, unreasonable, excessive, rigid, unadaptable. So if you're telling yourself in a situation, if I think of an example here, I want to try my best whenever I can. That might be a helpful rule to have. Trying your best isn't necessarily a bad thing. So whenever I can, that inserts a little bit of flexibility. It's adaptable to the certain situation, given the circumstances. But it becomes a little bit less helpful when you start saying, I must be the best. I have to be the best at everything I do, no matter what the cost. I must be perfect. Well, then it's tilting into this, unreasonable or, unflexible situation where you have to be perfect, and what's the risk of that? The risk is you're not always going to be perfect. And so you're setting yourself up for disappointment in that situation. So often their rules for living are attempts to compensate or balance out perceived weaknesses. So if you believe that a core belief is true, you come up with some rules that compensate for that. So if you think that you're not worthy, you're compensating maybe by trying to be perfect. You're really trying to make it so that's not the case. If I do things good enough, or if I'm the best at everything, maybe then I'll be good enough. And so sometimes these unhelpful behaviors or rules for living are called compensatory strategies because we're trying to compensate for this belief. They're meant to protect our self-esteem. So if we're perfect, like I said, we don't have to worry about not being enough. But it usually does the opposite because they're so excessive and rigid that we can't meet those standards. So an unhelpful core belief, the example is like it's like a painful wound, and rules for living is the effort to cover up this wound. And so the rules don't necessarily allow the wound to heal properly and can cause this excessive suffering. So some examples over here, I'm not good enough, so you work hard, never make a mistake, that perfectionism. If I don't get criticized, I'm okay, I'm all right as long as everyone else is happy. And so you can already see where someone might be set up to fail in those situations because they're going to make mistakes. You're going to be criticized. Not everyone is going to be happy all the time. And so there's a lot of effort involved in this, that when we're not able to meet those standards, it can lower our self-esteem even more. And so, like I said, the rules can be fine until we're not meeting them. It can take a lot of time and effort to meet them, often at great expense to ourselves. And inevitably, we're going to break these rules. And then that impacts how we feel, how we think, how we behave. So if you want to look at, any unhelpful rules that you might have in your life, the first thing that you have to do is reflect a bit. So with all of these, you're going to have to reflect on what your rules are, because your rules, your beliefs, these are all going to be different from person to person. So you can ask some questions to be able to start to identify these rules. So they often involve, like, what are your expectations about yourself? So you can look at common themes about your expectations for yourself. So what kind of situations make you the most anxious or give you the most self-doubt? What aspects of myself am I most critical of? Like, where am I most critical? In what situations? What about myself makes me feel very critical? What do other people do that makes me feel less confident about myself? So how someone reacts to me, in what situations do I feel less confident? You can start to look at, the negative evaluations you might have about yourself and other people. So when do you tend to put yourself down? What type of person would you become if you relax some of your most strict standards that you have for certain things? I like this one too. What do you criticize in other people? Because sometimes that identifies some of those dormant beliefs that might not be triggered until a situation happens. And so, if you look at someone that you don't agree with, what is it that you don't like about it? What is it you don't like about that person or that situation? And then you can reflect on messages you've received from others. So what have you been criticized or ridiculed for in your life? When have you been told things that have hurt the most? How did you receive praise and affection, when you were younger or even now? What do you have to do to get that from other people? What were you told to do or not to do when you were younger? And then I like this one too. Did your family have any sayings or mottos? And so, sayings like, practice makes perfect, all of those kind of mottos or sayings that might be entrenched in certain families can sometimes lead to these unhelpful rules that develop as we age. And so some examples of wording that often identifies some of these unhelpful rules, if there's must or should in there, usually that might be an unhelpful rule. So I must be the best at everything. I should never show signs of weaknesses. Those are extremes. And so if you see must or should in there, or must not or should not, usually those are rules that are rigid. And so those are good areas to target. And so when you're trying to adjust the rules, here's an example of a handout. And I'm happy to share these handouts with anyone that feels like it would be beneficial. But the gist of this is to just kind of break it down like you would do with a core belief. And so taking a rule or an assumption that you want to adjust and asking yourself, what is this rule? What impact has it had on my life? So this example of, I must do whatever it takes to stay slim or thin. How has that impacted this person's life? Putting a lot of pressure on themselves, using extreme measures, thinking and worrying about weight, food, body. How do you know when this rule is in operation? So when do you know that you're functioning under this rule? Well, this person said, whenever I'm eating and feeling guilty, or if I'm, having these guilty thoughts, where did this rule come from? Usually, especially with weight, people have some reason that they have these beliefs about themselves. Could be a friend, family, could just be society, messages that you've seen about people with bigger bodies that impacts how we think about ourselves. In what ways is this rule unreasonable? So here the person said, whenever I say to myself, I must do whatever it takes, I'm being inflexible and unreasonable. leads to extreme measures. Advantages and disadvantages of the rule. So breaking down, how has this rule helped you? How has this rule hurt you in your life? What are the advantages to living according to this rule, and how does it limit you? And then do the cons outweigh the pros? Is this something that's hurting me more than it's helping me? And the whole goal of this exercise is to develop this alternative rule, so a more balanced and flexible way to live your life. So what's a rule that would be more realistic, flexible, helpful? And usually it's a blend of maybe a little bit of this initial rule, but then also a more healthy take on it, or, incorporating maybe some of these disadvantages. So instead of I must do whatever it takes to stay, then they wrote out here, I enjoy being slim. However, it's more helpful that I think about trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle. So it's still acknowledging, hey, I want to be thin, and I want to do this. I want to have more strategies to maintain balance. So it's including both. It's not either or. And then how can you put this rule into practice? So exercising regularly rather than extreme exercise, checking out healthy portions. So how are you going to put this rule into place in your life? And so if you're going to make an adjustment in how you live your life, how are you going to do it? What situations are you going to use this rule for? And how are you going to adapt? And so the next factor I want to focus on here is negative predictions and unhelpful behaviors. So negative predictions are thoughts that arise when they're faced with a specific trigger. And so when this occurs, your mind will tend to make predictions about the situation you're facing, and these predictions will be influenced by your beliefs about yourself. And so usually when there's low self-esteem or negative core beliefs, you're making negative predictions about how you're going to function in a situation. So it might mean overestimating the likelihood that bad things will happen, maybe exaggerating how bad things will be. And you might not be conscious of this exaggeration. When you're thinking about it, it just seems like the worst possible outcome will happen. Underestimating your ability to handle things if it doesn't go well, dismissing factors that suggest maybe it wasn't as bad as you would predict it to be. And so the prediction often causes this discomfort, bodily, or our feelings, causes anxiety, and can lead to seeing the triggering situation as a threat, which then causes further unhelpful behaviors like avoiding a situation, engaging in safety behaviors throughout the situation to try to get through. This could be something like if someone's uncomfortable in a social situation, they're having more to drink, that's a safety behavior to try to get through the situation, or escaping the situation if things seem too difficult or overwhelming. So let's say that, you're having a negative prediction about how a doctor's visit will go, and you get into the waiting room and you feel completely overwhelmed. And so you just leave the situation. That's an example of likely unhelpful behavior because of that perceived threat, that prediction that you're making. So while it makes a lot of sense to engage in these behaviors to try to control the discomfort, unfortunately, when you're not confronting what's actually causing that fear and discomfort, you never have the opportunity to learn that the opposite might be true. So to find out how things would really turn out, if you were put in that situation, or if you faced what the threat might be. And so it just keeps this cycle going. And so an example here of the cycle, a visual example. So, whenever we're making these negative predictions here, so we talked about how the beliefs can lead to these negative predictions. You feel anxious, you avoid or you use safety behaviors. If this negative prediction comes true, then your beliefs are confirmed. Whatever fear you had or whatever you believe about yourself, it feels like you just proved it by meeting this negative prediction. If you don't meet it, especially if you have low self-esteem, often this positive information is discounted or distorted. So, I only did well because of X, Y, Z, not because I actually did well. It only wasn't anxiety provoking because, it just happened to be a fluke. So, you're kind of writing it off in some way. And so this is one of my favorite exercises for negative predictions, is this pie chart exercise. And so this is really helpful when you're having a prediction that might be extreme or exaggerated. So in this example here, it's for someone that has some health anxiety with bodily sensations. And so here the distorted belief or distorted prediction even is, that something is seriously physically wrong with the person because they're dizzy. And so if you've ever experienced a panic attack or anything that was sudden, unexplained, heightened anxiety, or some of those physical sensations like racing heart, dizziness, it's terrifying. And so it can feel like there is something really wrong. It's an emergency situation. And especially if you have health issues and you have underlying anxiety, sometimes it's hard to tease the two apart. And so the strength of this belief here, that something is physically wrong because they're dizzy, is 90%. And so you can make a list of all the possible, outcomes, let's say, of this situation. And so, the person could have a tumor, could be they stood up too quickly, didn't have anything to drink. And so you can see the range of severity of these predictions or these outcomes. And so once you finish, you can rate each one of these about how likely it is to happen, how much you think this is going to happen. And so you can actually chart it out here and see that this, fear that something is extremely wrong with you is actually just one small part of this pie chart. And so even with, situations where you're predicting something negative to happen based on, beliefs about your worth, a lot of times we can chart out those predictions and realize that, hey, it's only one possible outcome of many. And so that's the whole goal with charting this out and visualizing it in that way. Another way that you can test these negative predictions is through what we call a behavioral experiment. And so this is a nice, neat way to do that. But basically, the gist of it is that you're going to put down in writing, what this negative prediction is and how you can test it. So if you feel like if you're predicting you're going to fail at giving a presentation, you're going to test it. So you're going to give a presentation and you're going to see the outcome. Basically, you're evaluating the results of what actually happened versus what you feared would happen. And you really want to be aware of evidence to the contrary. If you feel like you're a failure and you get done with a presentation in that situation and you feel like you've failed, why? What specifically do you feel like you failed at? Oftentimes it's very minor things that maybe even other people didn't realize. And so you're really trying to be more inclusive of the situation than just what that initial perception is. And then the last factor here is critical self-talk. So that takes a hit on everyone's self-esteem, all of our confidence levels. How critical we are with ourselves can absolutely impact that. So when we're talking about building or rebuilding confidence, how we talk to ourselves is huge. And so everyone has an inner monologue, or this little voice in our head that comments on what we're doing, comments on the world around us. And when we have low self-esteem, it's often pretty harsh and critical. So it's pretty negative. It's skewed towards negativity. So you might blame yourself, put yourself down, call yourself names. And one issue with talking to yourself in these critical ways is that your brain can't necessarily distinguish between real threats and threats that you're just imagining. So you literally start to react as if you were being bullied. You're bullying yourself. And so it triggers this fight or flight system, increasing anxiety. We have these responses to how we talk to ourselves. Ultimately, the problem with self-critical talk is that it strengthens these negative core beliefs, whether it's fair, whether it's true. It's just feeding into that belief, that negative self-belief. And so the biggest question to ask yourself when you're being critical of yourself is, would you ever talk to a friend the same way you're talking to yourself? And if not, why? If you say to yourself, here, I'm a waste of space. If your friend came to you and said, I'm a waste of space, would you say, yeah, you are? Or would you say something different? That's one of the easiest ways to get yourself out of critical self-talk, is to look at how you would react to a friend that said that. And so this is just a compassionate thought challenge record that takes that one question a little bit further. And so in this situation, you write down basically your automatic thoughts, or the self the critical self-talk that you're experiencing, and you try to come up with a compassionate response. You know, so here, I'm so useless. You're not useless. Give yourself a mental hug right now. You know, like that might not be the most helpful thing that you would say, but how would you phrase, you know, some sort of compassionate response? And so I like these down here. You know, what would my best friend say to me? What would be a truly compassionate, what would a truly compassionate being say to me? What tone of voice would I need to be talked to in order to feel reassured? So, you know, even if you don't believe it, how could you talk to yourself in a more compassionate way? It's one of those things that once you start to practice it more, it starts to take root. And so you don't have to believe these things that are more compassionate or what you would tell a friend, but just starting to think about it can start to change how you think and feel about yourself. And so just to show you this little visual again, you know, now we can see how these core beliefs are, you know, set us up for making these unhelpful rules, which then can lead to these negative predictions and then this critical talk. And it just is this vicious cycle of low self-esteem, low self-confidence. And so when we're talking about, you know, treating this low self-esteem or improving our confidence, really we want to try to look at our core beliefs. We want to try to challenge any that might not be helpful for us, looking at our rules for living, developing more flexible rules, you know, testing these negative predictions or at least breaking them down a little bit, facing your fears and confronting situations, replacing that critical self-talk with self-compassion. I think that one is, if you had to take anything out of this webinar, that would be the one suggestion I would have for you, is trying to develop more compassionate self-talk. Because how we talk about ourselves to ourselves makes a really big difference in our confidence. And then living in line with these new core beliefs. So if you feel like you're someone with worth, how would you live your life? How would you do things differently? Even if you don't believe it initially, start to live like you do, and pretty soon your beliefs will follow. All right, and so I want to leave some time for any questions, comments, thoughts, but thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. You can drop your questions and comments into the Q&A, and I believe, let me just check, but I believe, yes. Attendees, you can also drop your comments into the chat. So your chat, you have the Q&A open to you. Please feel free to drop questions, comments. If you have a specific scenario that might have happened to you, this might be a good place to ask about it.
I'm also happy to answer any, you know, since it's the end of the year or the end of our webinar series for 2022, I'm happy to answer any questions from previous talks you might have attended or other questions that you have related to psychological issues or concerns.
This is it. This is your chance, everybody.
Well, I hope it's just that everyone's so confident and has such good self-esteem that there's no questions at all.
I hope so too. I'm not seeing any in the chat or the Q&A. So I think with that, I'm going to wish everybody happy holidays. And thank you, Devin, for another great year of webinars. We really appreciate it.
You're so welcome.
Wonderful, safe holiday. And I look forward to seeing everybody back here next year for more great webinars. Thank you so much, everybody, for a terrific, oh, hang on. Thank you for the webinar. This has been a very helpful session. Thank you, Melissa, for coming. We really appreciate everybody attending. And like I said, all of our webinars are archived on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to catch up on any that you've missed. Everybody, Happy holidays. Thank you.
Take care.